It was an ordinary morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood where the sound of birds chirping blended with the gentle hum of distant traffic. The houses, neatly lined up with manicured lawns, each told its own story of stability and routine. This was a place where families thrived, children played, and life flowed steadily like the steady stream of sunlight filtering through the trees. The world outside seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. Inside, one of these homes, there was a family living in what appeared to be perfect harmony. The sun had just risen, casting a soft, golden hue across the living room as Sarah sat at the kitchen table sipping her coffee. She wasn't just another mother, she was Emily's mother, a woman who had learned to embrace life's challenges with grace and resilience. Emily, her daughter, was the center of her universe. At just 12 years old, Emily had faced far more than any child should ever have to. Born with cerebral palsy, she was confined to a wheelchair. But that never stopped her from living life with a bright, contagious smile. The morning light caught Emily's face as she rolled herself into the kitchen, her bright eyes gleaming with excitement despite the limitations her body imposed on her. It was like her spirit radiated warmth, even in the early hours of the day. Emily's presence lit up any room she entered. She had a soft, infectious giggle that could melt the hardest of hearts, and a sense of wonder that only those who had to fight for every inch of their lives could possess. "Mom, can I have my pancakes today?" Emily's voice was gentle, but there was a certain sweetness in the way she spoke, a quiet innocence that had nothing to do with the world she had been forced to navigate. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah replied with a smile, a warmth in her eyes that spoke volumes. She was always there, always patient, always ready to take care of her daughter's needs. Sarah had made it her mission to ensure that Emily never felt defined by her disability. In her eyes, Emily was like any other child, strong, vibrant, and full of life. As Sarah began preparing breakfast, Emily maneuvered her wheelchair closer to the table. She loved mornings like these, where the whole day lay ahead of them, full of possibilities. Emily's favorite time of the day was when the sun was rising, when everything felt possible. She had a rhythm to her life that Sarah tried to mirror, never allowing the weight of the world's unfairness to settle too heavily on her shoulders. The air smelled of fresh pancakes, and the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower could be heard from outside. It was the kind of morning that everyone wished for, calm, ordinary, safe. Yet, beneath this tranquility, a subtle tension lingered in the air, almost as if the universe was holding its breath. The kind of feeling that comes just before a storm, when everything feels too still. As Emily looked out the window, her gaze lingered on the green, sunlit yard. She loved spending time outdoors, even if she couldn't run or play in the way other children could. She had learned to find joy in simple things. The feel of the breeze on her face, the way the leaves danced in the wind, the sight of a neighbor's children running through the yard, their laughter like music in the air. But there was something else lurking in the background of this picturesque scene. Something dark that had been building for weeks now. Emily didn't know it yet, but her world was about to change. The woman from across the street, the one who always seemed to have something to complain about, had been eyeing their house more than usual. Sarah hadn't noticed it at first. She had been too focused on the everyday challenges of caring for Emily. But the whispers had started, neighbors talking about the trouble with the HOA, the tightening grip of rules that felt more like prison bars than guidelines. The woman, Karen, who lived 3 houses down, was always lurking around, watching, waiting. Sarah had brushed it off as nothing more than the usual neighborhood gossip. But there was something in Karen's eyes that unsettled her. It was a look Sarah couldn't quite place, a coldness that made her stomach churn when she saw her in passing. It was as if Karen resented Emily's existence, the freedom she had despite her condition, the joy she radiated. It was subtle, but it was there, a resentment born out of something deeper, something ugly. In a world where people were supposed to help each other, where a sense of community should have been the foundation, Karen had become a constant thorn in Sarah's side. Every encounter felt like a slow burn, each complaint, each snide remark, Each cold stare felt like another drop in a cup that was now nearing the point of overflowing. Sarah didn't want to believe that someone could be so cruel, but deep down she knew. Something was coming. The air felt thick with it. It wasn't just the normal tension that came with any neighborhood conflict. This was different. Karen wasn't just the nosy neighbor who liked to complain. No, she was something far more dangerous, a woman who would go to any lengths to get what she wanted. Sarah had tried to avoid confrontation, to keep things civil for Emily's sake. But in the back of her mind, she could already feel the storm gathering, the calm before it had already settled in, and it was only a matter of time before the storm broke. As Emily continued to gaze out the window, her innocent joy remained untouched by the foreboding shadows. She didn't see it yet, but her world and her mother's was about to be torn apart. It would begin with something small, something that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. But for Sarah and Emily, it would be the beginning of a nightmare they never saw coming. The peacefulness of that morning would be the last they'd know for a long time. The storm was coming, and when it hit, it would change everything. It was another typical afternoon, the kind that blended seamlessly into the days before it. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed lawns. Emily was playing in the yard, her wheelchair resting beside her as she watched the squirrels dart between the trees. She smiled, lost in her own world, unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing on the other side of the street. Her mother, Sarah, was inside, busy with the mundane tasks that filled a mother's day. But in the background, an unseen presence was stirring, a shadow on the horizon, inching closer with each passing day. Her name was Deborah, or, as the neighbors had come to call her, HOA Karen. She lived 3 houses down, with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked as if it belonged in a magazine. The type of neighbor who took pride in their appearance, but whose beauty was more about perfection than sincerity. And behind her pristine facade, she hid a heart filled with judgment and resentment. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her, and nobody quite knew what to make of her. On the outside, she appeared to be an upstanding citizen, friendly, proper, and polite. But when you scratched the surface, a darker side revealed itself, one that was obsessive, demanding, and relentlessly critical. It started with small things, things that seemed trivial at first, but those little things, when accumulated, became something more. Sarah hadn't paid much attention at first. She was busy caring for Emily, trying to ensure her daughter's world was as normal as possible. She had enough on her plate without worrying about the HOA rules and regulations. But Deborah noticed everything. The smallest of infractions, the most insignificant of violations, she would find them. She had an eye for detail and a mouth that never stopped. The first complaint came in a simple note, neatly typed, the kind you'd expect from someone who thrived on rules. The lawn was slightly overgrown in a spot near the fence, a place where Sarah hadn't quite gotten around to trimming yet. It wasn't a big deal, not in the grand scheme of things. The rest of the yard was flawless, bright flowers, freshly cut grass, and neat borders. But to Deborah, it was a violation, a sign of disrespect to the community's sacred aesthetic. Sarah had shrugged it off, figuring that it was just a misunderstanding. She went outside, trimmed the grass, and left it at that. But Deborah wasn't so easily satisfied. No, she wasn't going to let something as small as this slide. The next note arrived within a week. This time, it wasn't the grass. It was the garden gnomes. Apparently, the whimsical little statues that Sarah had placed around the yard to make Emily smile were now distracting from the neighborhood's curated look. Another complaint, neatly typed, passive-aggressive in tone. This time, Sarah was annoyed. She could feel the tension between them growing, but she took a deep breath, reminding herself that her daughter's happiness mattered more than anything else. She moved the gnomes to a less conspicuous corner of the yard and decided she'd let it go. But Deborah wasn't finished. No, this was just the beginning. The first time Sarah ran into Deborah face-to-face was at the mailbox. It was a hot day, the kind where the air felt thick and still, and Sarah had just finished helping Emily with her wheelchair as they went to check the mail. Deborah was standing at the mailbox, arms crossed, waiting for her moment. The polite smile she wore didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Sarah," Deborah said, her voice far too cheery for the tension that lingered in the air. "I just wanted to remind you about the lawn. I noticed it's a little uneven near the fence again, and, well, the HOA has a rule about that, you know." Sarah felt a flush of frustration rise in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd heard about the rules, but Deborah's tone had a way of making it sound as if Sarah was somehow failing to be a responsible neighbor. "I've taken care of it, Deborah," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Everything's under control." Deborah's eyes flicked to the garden gnomes, her gaze calculating, almost dismissive. She hummed. "It's just that we have to maintain a certain standard. The neighborhood, you know? It's important." The word important felt like an accusation, as though Sarah had somehow violated some sacred code. It stung more than Sarah cared to admit. "I understand," Sarah said, trying to keep her cool. "I'll make sure everything is in order." As Deborah walked away, Sarah's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of her presence, her words lingering in the air like smoke. But she didn't have time for this. Emily needed her, and as always, she put her daughter first. Still, something about Deborah's tone, something in the way she acted, left Sarah unsettled. Over the next few weeks, the complaints grew more frequent. Every minor imperfection became ammunition in Deborah's arsenal, from the slight crack in the driveway to the way the leaves had fallen too far from the trees. There was always something. And it wasn't just about the appearance of the house anymore, it was personal. Deborah would stand in her yard, watching Emily play, her eyes narrowed as if trying to dissect every move. It was almost as if she was waiting for Emily to make some mistake, some imperfection to hold over her. It was at a neighborhood barbecue that Sarah first noticed the change. Deborah was there, of course, always in the thick of things, always managing to work her way into conversations, offering unsolicited advice about everything from house maintenance to parenting. But it wasn't her comments about the flowers or the fence that caught Sarah's attention. It was the way she looked at Emily. Deborah approached Emily, who was sitting in her wheelchair by the picnic table, her eyes scanning the scene as her mother talked to a neighbor. Deborah's smile was tight, forced, as if she were struggling to maintain some level of civility. "Isn't it hard, sweetie?" Deborah asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I mean, it must be difficult to play with the other kids. Can't run around like they can you?" Emily blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "I like to watch them," she replied softly, her voice carrying the warmth and innocence that always seemed to disarm people. "I see them run and I laugh." Sarah's blood boiled as she overheard the conversation from a distance. Deborah's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Well, that's good then," Deborah said, her voice almost too saccharine. "At least you're learning to appreciate what you have." Sarah's heart sank. She could feel the malice seeping through Deborah's words. This wasn't just about rules anymore, it was personal. And Deborah's gaze, that cold, calculating look, told Sarah everything she needed to know. This woman wasn't just a nuisance. She was dangerous. From that moment on, the tension in the neighborhood escalated. Deborah wasn't just complaining about the garden anymore. She was targeting Emily's family, subtly at first, but with increasing aggression. And Sarah could feel it growing inside her, a knot of anxiety that tightened with every passing day. It wasn't just about a few garden gnomes or a slightly overgrown lawn anymore. It was about something far deeper, something darker. And as Sarah stood by Emily, watching the neighborhood slowly change around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and this time, there was no running from it. It was a crisp afternoon when Sarah decided to take Emily to the local park for some fresh air. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows on the ground, and the air had a cool bite to it that made the leaves rustle ever so slightly in the breeze. The park was a familiar place, a safe haven where Emily could escape the confines of her wheelchair, if only for a moment, to feel the earth beneath her, to see the world around her unfurl with a sense of freedom that she didn't often get to experience. It wasn't the same as running through the grass like other kids, but it was enough for Emily. The park was her sanctuary. Sarah pushed Emily's wheelchair along the familiar path, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly in the growing silence of the park. They passed by the swings where children were laughing, the sound of their joy filling the air. Emily's eyes lit up at the sight. She loved watching the children play, her face lighting up with a mix of envy and delight. "Mom, can we go to the slide?" Emily asked, her voice soft but full of excitement. Sarah glanced over at the large, colorful slide that dominated the playground, a place where other children were chasing each other around. The sight tugged at her heart. Emily wanted so desperately to join in, to be like them, but she knew that her daughter's disability meant she would always be on the sidelines just watching. But today, Emily was in high spirits, and Sarah wanted to make this moment count. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah replied with a smile, pushing Emily toward the slide. "Let's get you close." As Sarah maneuvered the wheelchair to the edge of the slide, she noticed a few parents sitting on nearby benches, chatting among themselves. She didn't recognize them personally, but they all seemed to be enjoying their day. It was just another normal outing, or so she thought. But then, as if drawn by some invisible thread, Sarah's gaze shifted. Standing by the park entrance, she saw her. Deborah. HOA Karen. Deborah wasn't alone, but Sarah didn't need to know who the others were. Deborah's cold, calculating eyes were already trained on them. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid, as though she had come here with a singular purpose: to observe, to judge, to critique. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. It was almost as if Deborah had been waiting for this very moment to appear. Sarah quickly turned her attention back to Emily, trying to shake off the unease that was settling into her gut. The last thing she wanted was for this outing to be ruined by Deborah's presence, especially now, when Emily was so excited. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to paranoia, but as she bent down to help Emily on the slide, she could feel Deborah's eyes boring into the back of her head, like daggers aimed at her soul. As Sarah helped Emily ascend the small ramp to the slide, she could hear the faint sound of a camera clicking, too faint for anyone else to notice, but too loud for Sarah's ears. She stiffened, her hand pausing midair as she helped Emily onto the slide. The clicking continued, more deliberate this time, the unmistakable sound of a phone camera shutter. Sarah stood up straight and turned around slowly, her heart sinking. Deborah was there, standing at the far edge of the playground, her phone raised high, aimed directly at Emily. Deborah's eyes locked with Sarah's, and for a brief, horrifying moment, their gaze met. Sarah felt the weight of that look, the cold, unblinking stare of a woman who was watching not just for a moment of perfection, but for something else, something sinister. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a woman taking a photo. This wasn't about a snapshot to remember a good day at the park. No, this was something darker. This was a woman trying to capture something uncomfortable, something she could use, something she could twist. "Deborah," Sarah called out, her voice more of a demand than a question. Deborah lowered her phone just enough to meet Sarah's eyes, a thin smile curling on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Just taking a picture of the lovely day," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, too sweet. "You know, it's always so charming to see a little girl having fun in the park. So innocent, so brave." The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and condescending. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She didn't know how to respond. What could she say? She knew that any attempt to reason with Deborah would be futile. Deborah wasn't here to admire the view. She wasn't here for the kids playing or for the sunshine. She was here to make her presence felt, to assert her power. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice more clipped now. "Let's go. It's time to head home." But Emily, oblivious to the growing tension, was grinning from ear to ear as she slid down the slide. The rush of joy was palpable in her eyes, as if the world around her had melted away, leaving only the thrill of the moment. Sarah couldn't help but smile at her daughter, but the smile didn't last long. Another click. This time it was louder, closer. Sarah's gaze snapped back to Deborah, who had taken several steps forward, her phone raised again. "Stop," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Stop taking pictures of my daughter." Deborah's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the smile on her face faltering just for a moment before it returned with an almost predatory glint. "I'm not doing anything wrong, Sarah. I'm just making memories." The words were like daggers, their sweetness masking the venom beneath. "I told you to stop," Sarah repeated, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, bubbling up with each passing second. This was no longer about neighborhood complaints about lawn maintenance or garden gnomes. This was personal. Deborah had crossed a line. Emily, now at the bottom of the slide, looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes. She sensed the tension in the air, though she didn't fully understand what was happening. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked quietly. Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to smile at Emily. "Nothing, sweetheart. Let's go." But Deborah wasn't done. She took another step closer, her phone still raised, still capturing moments that didn't belong to her. "It's just a picture, Sarah. Don't be so sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing." The words stung, but they weren't what cut the deepest. It was the look in Deborah's eyes, the way she reveled in the discomfort she was causing. It was the deliberate way she made Sarah feel small, insignificant, and powerless in front of her daughter. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for Emily's wheelchair, suddenly desperate to leave, to escape the oppressive weight of Deborah's presence. The day, which had begun with the promise of a peaceful outing, had been tainted. The dark cloud that had hovered just on the edge of the horizon had finally arrived. "Come on, Emily," Sarah said, her voice strained. She pushed the wheelchair forward, making a beeline for the park exit. But as she passed Deborah, she felt the chill of her stare on the back of her neck. The unsettling feeling that something much worse was coming washed over Sarah like a cold wave. It wasn't just about the pictures. It wasn't even about the tension Deborah had created between them. This was about power, control, and something much darker lurking beneath the surface. And Sarah had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The sun had begun its descent, bathing the park in the soft golden hues of late afternoon. The breeze had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves on the trees, but it was still warm enough to feel comfortable. Everything about this moment, about this place, felt like a brief escape. It was supposed to be an afternoon of peace, of joy, of laughter. Emily had been so excited to come here. She'd spent the entire morning talking about the park, about the slide, about watching the other kids play. Sarah had put all of her energy into making this day as perfect as possible. She had planned for it to be a normal, safe outing. But that was before Karen. That was before the storm that had quietly gathered, waiting for its moment to break. As Sarah pushed Emily's wheelchair toward the slide, she could still feel Karen's presence lurking at the edge of her awareness. The woman had stood just far enough away to be out of earshot, but not so far that Sarah didn't know she was there. Her eyes never left them, cold and calculating. Sarah had told herself to ignore her, that she was just being paranoid. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something much worse than a few misplaced complaints about lawns and gnomes. The unease that had been simmering for weeks now felt like it was coming to a head. Emily giggled as she slid down the slide, her joy palpable in the way her eyes sparkled. It was the first time in days that Sarah had seen her so carefree. Emily's laughter rang out beautiful and bright. It filled Sarah's heart with warmth, and for a moment, she thought that maybe this was what they both needed. A chance to forget about the drama, about the tension, about Deborah. But as Emily slid to the ground, Sarah's world shattered. The sound of a knife slicing through the air was the first thing that broke the illusion of peace. Sarah froze. It happened in an instant. 1 second, Emily was smiling, standing on the edge of the slide, excited to go again, and the next there was a scream, sharp and horrifying. It was Emily's scream, high-pitched, desperate, filled with an unspeakable pain. And then the sickening, wet sound of flesh being pierced. Sarah turned toward the noise, her heart leaping in her chest. Time slowed as she turned, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. There, in front of Emily, was Deborah, her face twisted into an expression of sick satisfaction, a twisted, malevolent grin playing at the corners of her mouth. In her hand was a knife, shiny sharp, a weapon that didn't belong here, that didn't belong anywhere. And she was smiling, not with joy, but with something darker, something more terrifying. She had just stabbed Emily. The blade was still buried in her daughter's leg, blood already pooling on the ground beneath them. Sarah's heart stopped. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she rushed forward, her legs moving before her brain had fully processed what was happening. She dove toward her daughter, her hands trembling as she reached for the knife, desperate to pull it from Emily's body. But before she could reach them, Deborah stepped back, holding the knife with a twisted satisfaction. Deborah didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look on her face said everything. It was like she was relishing every second, every ounce of pain she was inflicting, as though Emily's suffering was nothing more than an indulgence. Her fingers tightened around her phone, and Sarah realized, horrifyingly, Deborah was filming it. She was filming this moment, filming the attack, for her own sick pleasure. The air around Sarah seemed to thicken, pressing in on her chest, suffocating her. She had no words. She couldn't make sense of it. None of it made sense. "Mom," Emily's voice broke through the fog, a small, weak cry. Her breath shallow as she clutched at her leg, her fingers stained with blood, Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her hands reaching for Emily, desperate to comfort her. She wasn't thinking anymore. She didn't care about the knife, didn't care about Deborah, didn't care about anything except getting Emily the help she needed. But as she reached her daughter, time seemed to stop. Sarah pulled Emily into her arms, trying to shield her from Deborah, trying to block out the horrors of the moment. She could feel the warmth of Emily's blood soaking through her clothes, could hear the raggedness of her breathing as her daughter struggled, fighting against the pain. "Hold on, baby. Just hold on," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mom, it hurts. It hurts so much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah could barely hold it together. Her fingers fumbled as she reached for her phone, dialing 911. She could hear the operator's calm voice, asking for details, but everything seemed distant, as though the world outside had been muffled by the weight of the horror that was unfolding in front of her. But Deborah was still there, still filming, still standing just a few feet away, her phone aimed at them like some twisted spectator to the madness. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with terror and disbelief. "Stop filming, you sick!" Deborah raised a hand, almost as if in mockery of the plea. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and as Sarah's words cut through the air, Deborah only smiled wider. There was no remorse, no regret. She was enjoying this. Sarah's body shook as she held Emily close, feeling her daughter's trembling form in her arms. "Please, please, help me," she whispered, her tears falling onto Emily's bloodstained shirt. "Don't you dare," Deborah spat, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have let her be like that. She doesn't deserve sympathy." Sarah's blood boiled at her words, but she couldn't focus on anything except Emily, who was growing weaker in her arms. The wound was deep, the blood coming too fast, and no matter how much Sarah tried to comfort her, it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. "Stay with me. Emily, stay with me," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You're going to be okay. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Just hang on." But Emily's eyes fluttered, her grip on Sarah's hand weakening as the life drained out of her. "Mom, I'm scared, I know, sweetheart. I know." Sarah's voice broke as she tried to soothe her daughter, but the fear in Emily's eyes was like a dagger to Sarah's heart. Her daughter had always been brave, had always been the light in Sarah's world. But now, her light was flickering. Seconds felt like hours, and Sarah couldn't tell if the 911 operator had been able to hear her through her frantic sobs. Everything was happening so fast, so violently. The park that had once been a haven now felt like a nightmare. the world turning into a blur of motion, of confusion, of pain. And then a terrible, haunting laugh. Deborah, the woman who had just attacked her daughter, who was still filming, still relishing every moment of this horror, was laughing. It wasn't loud, but it was chilling. A sick, twisted laugh that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just a woman who had snapped. No, Deborah was something far worse. She was a predator, and Emily was her prey. Isn't this just perfect? Deborah said, her voice dripping with venom. You wanted to be special, didn't you? Wanted the world to notice you? Well, now they will. But Sarah couldn't hear her anymore. She couldn't focus on the monster who stood before them. Her world had narrowed down to Emily, her daughter, her baby, whose life was slipping away in her arms. Hold on, Emily. Just hold on, Sarah repeated over and over, as though saying the words could somehow keep the darkness at bay. But she knew, deep down, that it was too late. The damage had already been done. As the seconds stretched into eternity, Sarah felt the world around her blur into nothingness. The only thing that mattered now was Emily. And no matter how hard she tried, no matter how desperately she clung to hope, the reality was inescapable. Her daughter had been taken from her, and nothing in the world could undo it. The flashing lights of the ambulance sliced through the darkening night, casting long shadows across the pavement. Sarah sat beside Emily, gripping her daughter's hand with everything she had. The pain was almost unbearable, not just the searing agony of the knife wound that Emily had suffered, but the ache in her heart, the overwhelming, suffocating weight of helplessness. Emily was unconscious now, her breath shallow and uneven as the paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize her. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts fragmented, barely coherent. The world around her felt distant, as though she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But the truth was undeniable. Her daughter was in critical condition, and the woman who had done this was walking free. "Stay with me, Emily," Sarah whispered, pressing her lips to Emily's cold hand. "Please stay with me. You're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." The words felt hollow, empty, but she had to say them. She had to believe them. Because without that hope, what else did she have? As the ambulance sped through the streets, Sarah's mind wandered back to the attack, the way everything had unfolded so quickly, the sickening sound of the knife plunging into her daughter's flesh, Deborah's cold, twisted grin as she filmed the entire thing. The images flashed through her mind like a loop she couldn't escape from. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and yet it had been all too real. By the time they reached the hospital, the terror of the moment had settled into a dull, aching numbness. Sarah was a bundle of raw nerves, her body trembling, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. How had this happened? Why had Deborah done this? And most importantly, how could she make Deborah pay for what she had done to Emily? Inside the sterile hospital walls, everything felt mechanical, cold, impersonal. The hustle and bustle of doctors and nurses moving through the hallways, the beeping of machines monitoring Emily's vitals, all of it served to remind Sarah of how fragile her daughter's life truly was. But it wasn't just Emily's life hanging in the balance now. It was Sarah's, too. She was trapped in a suffocating fog of fear and grief, unable to see clearly, unable to make sense of any of it. Hours passed, but it felt like days. Emily was taken into surgery, and Sarah was left in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, her fingers digging into her palms as she tried to steady her racing heart. The thought of Emily lying there, vulnerable and alone on that operating table, was enough to make her lose control. She wanted to scream. She wanted to break something. She wanted to hold Deborah accountable, to make her feel the pain that Sarah felt. But when the doctor finally emerged from the operating room, his expression grim, all the words she had been choking back finally spilled out. "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the ground before meeting Sarah's gaze. "She's stable for now. The wound was deep and there's a lot of bleeding, but we managed to control it. It'll take time, but she'll pull through. She's strong." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, relief and exhaustion crashing over her in waves. Emily was alive. She had a chance. But as the weight of the situation continued to press down on her, the anger simmered just below the surface. Can you tell me, how did this happen? Sarah whispered. Her voice was a mere fraction of what it had once been, weak, brittle. She was still grappling with the horror of what had happened to her daughter, and now she was fighting for justice, too. The doctor's expression softened, but his eyes were filled with understanding. The police are going to want to talk to you. You should have someone with you when they arrive. The mention of the police brought Sarah back to reality. Deborah was still out there, walking free. No one had arrested her yet. No one had stopped her from hurting Emily. The injustice of it was suffocating. The police arrived shortly after, their presence a necessary but unwelcome intrusion. They asked questions, too many questions, and every time Sarah tried to answer, the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. How could she explain the sheer terror, the helplessness, the sickening disbelief that had filled her as she watched Deborah harm her daughter? The officers took notes, asked for the details of the attack, and made it clear that they would need to speak to Emily once she was awake. But Sarah couldn't help but notice the way they looked at her. They were polite, yes, but there was a distance in their eyes. A part of her felt like they weren't truly hearing her, weren't truly seeing the extent of the crime. The way they treated her, as though they were merely going through the motions, not grasping the gravity of what had happened, sent a chill down her spine. One officer, a man in his 40s with a graying beard, asked, "So, Ms. Larson, can you tell us exactly what happened?" Sarah clenched her fists, trying to steady her trembling hands. "Deborah, Karen, she attacked my daughter. She stabbed her. She did it while filming it, for God's sake." She was standing there, smiling, recording it all like it was some kind of sick game. I couldn't even protect her." Her voice cracked, and the tears began to fall freely. The officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to speak to Deborah. We'll review the footage. But we need your daughter's statement first. That will help us build the case." Sarah's mind raced. They were going to speak to Deborah, but what did that mean? What if Deborah twisted the story? What if the police didn't believe her? What if they brushed it off as if it were just another conflict between neighbors? The idea of Deborah walking free, unpunished, gnawed at Sarah's insides. It felt like a betrayal. Don't you understand? Sarah's voice rose, breaking with frustration. This wasn't just a random act. This was premeditated. She's been tormenting us for weeks, trying to get under my skin. And now she's attacked my daughter. She stabbed her. You don't just let someone like that go. The officer shifted uneasily but didn't respond immediately. Sarah knew she was being heard, but it didn't feel like enough. It never felt like enough. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, police questioning, and sleepless nights. Emily remained in critical care, but she was strong, stronger than Sarah had ever given her credit for. As Sarah watched her daughter fight for life, she couldn't help but feel that same determination rise within her. Emily deserved justice, and she, as her mother, would make sure she got it. But every step toward that justice seemed to be met with an obstacle. The police had questioned Deborah, but they hadn't arrested her. They hadn't even charged her. They were still gathering evidence. Sarah felt like she was suffocating under the weight of the system's indifference. She couldn't understand why they were moving so slowly. Emily's life had been shattered, and yet the wheels of justice turned too slowly for Sarah's comfort. Days passed, and Sarah grew more and more frustrated. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus on anything except one thing: getting Deborah to pay for what she had done. She had to make sure the system didn't fail them. She had to fight for her daughter. One evening, while Emily was sleeping in the hospital, Sarah received a phone call. It was the police. They had reviewed the footage from Deborah's phone, and what they found was even worse than they had imagined. Deborah had filmed the entire attack, every second. The footage showed Emily struggling, begging for mercy, and Deborah standing over her, relishing the pain she was causing. The footage was chilling, undeniable evidence of the crime. But it wasn't just the footage that shocked Sarah. It was the realization that Deborah had been planning this for weeks, stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with the evidence in hand, the police could finally take action. The arrest came the next morning. Deborah was taken into custody, her smug demeanor replaced with the cold reality of facing charges. Sarah's heart was heavy with relief, but it wasn't over. The fight for justice had only just begun. In the days and weeks that followed, the full extent of Deborah's cruelty was revealed. The court hearings were long and drawn out, filled with legal jargon and courtroom drama. But for Sarah, there was only one thing that mattered: her daughter's healing, both physically and emotionally. Justice would be served. It had to be. The air in the courtroom felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that hung over the proceedings like a dark cloud. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of her seat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Today was the day. After everything, after the trauma, the pain, the uncertainty, this was the moment when everything would come to light. When Deborah, the woman who had destroyed her daughter's life, would finally be forced to face the consequences of her actions. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people took their seats, but Sarah's focus was unwavering. Her eyes never left the front of the room, where Deborah sat, flanked by her lawyer, looking calm, almost too calm, like she was above it all. Her posture was stiff, her face a mask of indifference, as if she had nothing to fear. But Sarah could see through it. She could see the cracks in Deborah's carefully constructed facade. Deborah knew the walls were closing in. She knew the truth would be exposed, and Sarah was determined to make sure of it. The judge took his seat, and the room fell silent. The trial was about to begin. Deborah's lawyer rose, speaking in a smooth, practiced tone, trying to downplay the gravity of the situation. But Sarah could barely hear the words, her mind focused entirely on the woman who had shattered her family's peace, who had caused so much harm. Deborah sat there, smug and unrepentant, but Sarah could see the fear just beneath the surface. She had no idea that the final confrontation was about to unfold in a way that would shatter her sense of control forever. As the trial progressed, the tension between Sarah and Deborah simmered beneath the surface. Sarah had given her testimony, describing the attack in excruciating detail, recounting the horrific moment when she had seen her daughter stabbed, the blood pooling beneath Emily's frail body, the sickening smile on Deborah's face as she filmed it all. Sarah had relived the nightmare over and over, but today, it was going to be different. Today, Sarah wasn't just going to tell her story, she was going to expose Deborah for the monster she truly was. The moment came when the prosecution called for the key evidence, the footage from Deborah's phone. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the video began to play. The courtroom went eerily silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the projector and the rustling of papers. On the screen, Deborah's face appeared, cold and emotionless as she stood above Emily, the knife in her hand. The image of her daughter, vulnerable and terrified, filled the screen. Emily's screams echoed through the room, and Sarah fought back the urge to break down. But she couldn't. Not now. The footage continued to play, the camera capturing the sickening moment when the blade plunged into Emily's leg. Deborah didn't hesitate. She didn't show an ounce of remorse. Instead, she smiled as Emily cried out in pain. The room was deathly silent, the gravity of the footage settling over everyone like a heavy weight. But it was more than just the video that made Sarah's blood boil, it was the way Deborah had manipulated the entire situation. The video didn't just capture the attack. It captured Deborah's sick enjoyment, her reveling in the violence she had inflicted. It was damning evidence, and it made Sarah's blood run cold. As the video ended, the courtroom remained still. The judge's gavel struck once, then twice, and the room erupted into hushed conversations. The truth was out. Deborah could no longer hide behind her polished mask of civility. The manipulative facade she had worked so hard to build had crumbled, and all that was left was the stark reality of who she truly was. But Deborah wasn't finished yet. As Sarah sat there, feeling the weight of the moment lift slightly, she noticed Deborah stir in her seat. The smug expression had returned to her face, and her lawyer was already preparing a defense. He stood up, speaking in a tone that was too calm, too collected, almost as if he was trying to downplay the gravity of the evidence. "I would like to remind the court," he said, "that this footage, while disturbing, is not the full context. It's an edited clip, and we don't know what led to this moment. My client has been under immense stress from the HOA situation. This was a tragic accident, a moment of irrationality, not premeditated violence." Sarah's blood boiled. He was trying to twist the narrative to make it seem like Deborah was the victim in all of this. He was trying to manipulate the court to make them believe that her daughter's suffering was somehow justified by the pressure of HOA rules. But Sarah wouldn't let him. She stood up, her heart racing, her voice steady as she addressed the courtroom. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of irrationality. This was premeditated. Deborah has been tormenting us for weeks. The complaints, the passive-aggressive comments, the way she would watch my daughter from across the street, it was all part of her sick game. She enjoyed seeing us suffer, and when she couldn't break us with her words, she resorted to violence. The room fell silent again, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. Deborah's lawyer tried to interrupt, but Sarah didn't let him. "I know what this looks like," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know the footage is hard to watch. It's hard for me to watch, too. But this wasn't some random act. This was a woman who took pleasure in hurting my daughter, a woman who saw a vulnerable child and decided that she wasn't worthy of sympathy. She filmed the attack, she laughed at Emily's pain, and she wanted to make us suffer for something as small as her jealousy and hate." Sarah's words rang out in the silence, each one like a hammer striking the gavel. The courtroom was silent, and for the first time, Deborah's smugness faltered. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with Sarah. But Sarah wasn't done. "The truth is, Deborah didn't just stab my daughter. She stabbed every mother who has ever tried to protect her child. She stabbed every family who has ever been victimized by hate. And today, we're going to make sure she faces the consequences of that." As Sarah finished her statement, she sat back down, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time, she felt like the truth was finally being heard. The battle wasn't over yet, but the wheels of justice were finally turning in the right direction. Deborah's lawyer stood up, trying to mount some sort of defense, but it was clear that the evidence was overwhelming. Deborah had no escape. The truth had been exposed for all to see, and no amount of manipulation or lies could hide it now. The final moments of the trial were a blur. The judge deliberated for what felt like hours, but when the verdict finally came down, it was clear. Deborah was guilty. The charges of assault with intent to harm, aggravated assault, and child endangerment were brought against her. The judge's words felt like a weight lifting off Sarah's chest. "Deborah Smith, you are hereby found guilty of all charges," the judge declared. "You will be held accountable for your actions, and you will face the consequences of the harm you've inflicted." The gavel struck, and Deborah's world came crashing down. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, she could finally breathe. The air felt different, lighter. Justice had been served. But more than that, the truth had been exposed. The evil that Deborah had tried to hide behind her perfect lawn and false civility had been brought to light, and Sarah had made sure of it. Emily's road to recovery would be long, but Sarah knew that, no matter what, they had won, not just for Emily, but for every person who had ever been hurt, manipulated, or silenced. This was their victory, and they would carry it with them forever. The days that followed the trial were a blur for Sarah and Emily. The immediate relief of Deborah's conviction slowly gave way to the harsh reality of their new lives. Justice had been served, but the journey wasn't over. Emily's recovery, both physical and emotional, was a long, painful road. The stab wound had healed, but the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. And for Sarah, the trauma of seeing her daughter in such pain would never truly fade. In the weeks after the trial, the family spent as much time together as possible. Emily was still recovering, though she was stronger than Sarah had ever imagined. The young girl's spirit, which had always been a source of light, began to return slowly. She laughed again, though it was quieter now, more guarded. It took time, but Emily had always been resilient. The days spent in the hospital, those long, sleepless nights by her side, had only strengthened the bond between them. Sarah would never forget the look in Emily's eyes when she was finally able to sit up on her own, her small hands gripping Sarah's tightly as if to say, "I'm still here, Mom." But while Emily healed physically, the emotional scars ran deep. The trauma of that Halloween night, the blood, the screams, Deborah's twisted smile, haunted Emily in ways that were hard to put into words. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The nightmares would come, and Sarah would find herself holding Emily close, whispering soothing words, telling her everything would be okay. But it wasn't that simple. Emily wasn't just recovering from an attack. She was recovering from the betrayal of her own neighborhood, the betrayal of someone who had been so close to their lives, someone who should have been a protector, not a predator. Despite everything, Emily began to show signs of strength. She started therapy, and while the sessions were often difficult and painful, they allowed her to process the anger, the confusion, and the fear that had built up inside her. Slowly but surely, the darkness that had settled over her began to lift, bit by bit. It wasn't a perfect recovery, and Sarah knew that the scars, emotional and psychological, would take much longer to heal. But Emily was alive. She was fighting, and that was all Sarah needed to hold on to. For Sarah, the trauma was no less intense. The images of that night, of Emily crying out in pain, of Deborah's cold, indifferent gaze, were etched into her memory. They haunted her in the quiet moments when she thought she could finally relax, when she allowed herself to imagine a life without fear. But it was always there, the shadow of what Deborah had done, lingering just out of reach, ready to strike again. Sarah had to remind herself every day that they were free now, that Deborah would never hurt them again. But the memories would never be fully erased. And yet, as the months passed, Sarah began to see hope on the horizon. The worst had happened, but now they were stronger. The community, once divided and unsure of how to react to Deborah's actions, came together in support. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, who had been too afraid to speak out, now offered their help in ways Sarah hadn't expected. They checked in on Emily, made sure she had what she needed, and most importantly, they reminded her that she was not alone. It wasn't the kind of support that erased the pain, but it was enough to show Emily that the world still had goodness in it, that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. The aftermath of the trial also brought about an unexpected change within Sarah. She had never been one to seek attention or sympathy. She had always kept her emotions to herself, believing that if she could protect Emily and keep their family intact, that would be enough. But after everything they had been through, Sarah realized that she had a responsibility to speak out, not just for Emily, but for every person who had ever been hurt by someone like Deborah. For the first time, Sarah found herself using her voice in ways she never had before, speaking at local events, advocating for victims of violence, and working with organizations that supported families like hers. Her voice became a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, a reminder that they were not alone. And Emily, in her own way, began to find strength in her mother's courage. Though she was still recovering, Emily's spirit began to emerge once more, quietly at first, but steadily. She used her experience to help others, sharing her story with those who needed to hear it, showing them that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. In the quiet moments at home, Sarah would look at her daughter, at the girl who had been through so much and yet still found a way to smile, still found a way to move forward, and her heart would swell with pride. Emily wasn't just recovering from an attack, she was reclaiming her life, taking back what had been stolen from her. Sarah had no doubt that one day, Emily would be stronger for all of this, and that despite the horrors they had faced, they would find peace again. But peace was a long road, and it wasn't one Sarah could walk alone. It was a road they would walk together. It was Halloween again, almost a year since the attack, and though the memories still loomed large, they had learned to reclaim the day. The house was decorated, not with the usual festive cheer, but with small symbols of strength, things that reminded them of their journey. The pumpkins that lined the porch were carved with intricate designs, each one a small act of defiance against the darkness that had once surrounded them. Emily, with her quiet smile, helped her mother carve them, her hands steady as she worked on her own pumpkin. This year, they weren't just celebrating Halloween, they were celebrating life and their ability to keep going no matter the pain. As night fell, they sat together on the porch, handing out candy to the children who came by. There was laughter in the air, the sounds of children's costumes rustling as they ran up and down the street, and for a moment, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that meant everything was perfect, that everything had been erased. But it was enough. They had survived the storm, and though the scars would never fully fade, they were moving forward, together. As the last trick-or-treater left their doorstep, Emily looked up at Sarah with a quiet, knowing smile. "Mom, I'm okay. We're okay." Sarah's heart tightened in her chest. "Yes, we are," she whispered, pulling Emily close and pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We're more than okay. We're stronger than we've ever been." And in that moment, Sarah understood something profound, something that would stay with her forever. The darkest moments in life could break you, tear you apart, and make you question everything. But they could also reveal a strength you never knew you had, a light that could never be extinguished no matter how hard the darkness tried. And as she held her daughter close, Sarah knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would always rise. Together. The legacy of Halloween would forever be a reminder of how far evil could go when unchecked. But more importantly, it would be a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. The legacy of Halloween, for Sarah and Emily, was one of survival, and it was only just beginning. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the HOA stories for more gripping and emotional narratives. Don't miss out on future episodes where we dive deep into the most intense and heart-wrenching tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of suspense, drama, and real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join us as we continue exploring the dark side of community life, because the HOA stories are just getting started.